Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. He died with debts so large his family had to sell his house to survive. He condemned slavery as a moral evil, yet he enslaved hundreds and fathered children with one of them. America remembers the genius. This story exposes the cost. The truth about Thomas Jefferson is simple and uncomfortable: a brilliant mind, drowning in debt, and one of history's greatest moral contradictions. In the mid-18th century, a Virginia planter was a peculiar creature who lived like a king but balanced precariously on a tightrope of credit. To the outside observer, these men were lords of the earth, masters of vast domains who drank imported wine, raced thoroughbred horses, and dressed in the finest silks. But the economic reality beneath the velvet coat was a house of cards. Their wealth was not gold stored in a vault. It was tobacco in the ground and human beings in the fields. Tobacco was a volatile, treacherous crop that drained the soil of nutrients and fluctuated wildly in price on the London market. A planter could be rich in January and destitute in December, yet the social code of the Virginia gentry dictated that his lifestyle could never change. To cut back on spending was to admit failure. To sell land was to lose honor. So they borrowed. They borrowed from British merchants to buy the silver buckles on their shoes, the carriages they rode in, and the education for their sons. They signed promissory notes with a flourish of the quill, pushing the debt into a vague, misty future that they refused to look at directly. Debt was not a source of shame for the young Jefferson. It was a tool of the trade, the very water he swam in. Thomas Jefferson inhaled this culture with his first breath. His father, Peter Jefferson, was a self-made giant of a man, a surveyor, a mapmaker, and a massive landowner. When Peter died, he left his son thousands of acres of land and dozens of slaves, but he also left him the crushing expectation of greatness. Thomas was not bred to be a simple farmer. He was bred to be a gentleman. And in Virginia, a gentleman's primary duty was to curate his surroundings, to reflect his intellect. However, the psychological break, the moment the addiction to material objects truly took root in Jefferson's psyche, can be traced to a specific traumatic afternoon, February 1st, 1770. Jefferson was 26 years old, a brilliant, ambitious young lawyer living at his childhood home, Shadwell. He had spent years painstakingly building a library, spending a fortune on legal texts, classics, and history books. For a man like Jefferson, books were not just paper and ink. They were his external brain, his connection to the wider world, and his primary source of comfort. On that February afternoon, while Jefferson was away, a fire broke out in a chimney and consumed the wooden house with terrifying speed. By the time the news reached him, Shadwell was nothing but a pile of ash. When the messenger delivered the news, Jefferson asked a single question. He did not ask about the family silver, the furniture, or the crops. He asked about his books. The library? The messenger shook his head and replied, "All gone." Then, in a small attempt at consolation, the man added, "But we saved your fiddle, sir." The loss was catastrophic. Jefferson fell into a deep depression, writing to a friend that while the value of the books could be estimated in money, the value to him was incalculable. It was a trauma of erasure that burned away his intellectual foundation. Most men, after such a loss, would become cautious, fearing the fire and hoarding their money. Jefferson did the opposite. He reacted with a manic, compulsive need to replace what was lost, and not just replace it, but exceed it. He began to buy with a frenzy that defied logic, ordering books he might need, books he simply wanted, and books on every conceivable subject from architecture to gardening. He spent money he did not have to fill the void the fire had burned into his psyche, beginning a lifelong pattern where he equated buying with healing. This compulsion to build a fortress against the chaos of the world led him to the top of a mountain where he began the construction of Monticello in 1769. It was a romantic, impractical location where water had to be hauled up by hand and bricks had to be fired on site. Jefferson did not hire a contractor. He became the architect, studying Palladio and drawing the plans himself. Crucially, he used his enslaved workforce to execute this vision, marking the beginning of his moral schizophrenia. He wrote eloquently about the moral depravity of slavery, yet he transformed human labor into Italian neoclassical architecture, using the very institution he claimed to hate to build the sanctuary he loved. Monticello was not just a house, it was a stage set for the character he wanted to play, the philosopher king. But stage sets are expensive, and in 1772, he made a decision that would seal his financial doom forever. He married Martha Wales Skelton. Martha was a young widow, beautiful, musical, and intelligent, and Jefferson loved her deeply. But in the ledger of his life, Martha came with a terrifying dowry. Her father, John Wales, was a massive slaveholder and land speculator who lived high and leveraged deep. When Wales died in 1774, Thomas and Martha inherited a fortune on paper, 135 enslaved people, and 11,000 acres of land. Jefferson's net worth skyrocketed, making him one of the wealthiest men in the colonies. However, John Wales was a creature of the debt culture, and along with the assets, he left a debt to British merchants totaling nearly 4,000 pounds, a staggering sum in modern purchasing power that was enough to ruin a man. Jefferson faced a critical choice. He could have sold the land and the 135 slaves immediately to pay off the British creditors, wiping the slate clean to start his marriage with a smaller estate, but zero debt. It was the rational, prudent financial move. He refused. He refused because selling the land meant shrinking his domain, and selling the slaves meant diminishing his status as a patriarch. In his mind, land was the only real wealth, and to sell it to pay a debt was a sin against his class. He convinced himself, using his brilliant but delusional mathematical mind, that he could grow his way out of the debt, calculating that the profits from tobacco and wheat would pay off the interest and principal within a few years. He was catastrophically wrong. He had inherited a poisoned chalice. The debt was denominated in British sterling, but his assets were in depreciating colonial currency. The interest compounded, the crops failed, and the Revolutionary War disrupted trade. Instead of paying off the debt, Jefferson ignored it, compartmentalizing it like a distant, annoying relative while absorbing the 135 enslaved people into his workforce to expand Monticello. Among the property he inherited from his father-in-law was a specific family, the Hemings. Betty Hemings was the matriarch, a woman of mixed race who had been the concubine of John Wales. This meant that the enslaved family Jefferson inherited were actually his wife's half-siblings. Sally Hemings was a toddler at the time, arriving at Monticello as part of the inheritance, the half-sister of the mistress of the house. This created a twisted intimacy within the household, where Martha Jefferson looked out the window and saw her own sisters and brothers working in the fields or serving in the kitchen, enslaved by her husband. It was a secret everyone knew and no one spoke of. The original sin of the household that lay dormant, waiting for its moment to surface. For 10 years, Jefferson lived in this bubble of debt and domesticity. He wrote the Declaration of Independence, served as governor, and fled from British troops, all while maintaining the veneer of a wealthy patriarch. Then, the second great trauma struck. On September 6, 1782, Martha Jefferson died. She had been weak from repeated childbirths, and her death shattered Jefferson completely. This was not the hoarding trauma of the fire. This was the emptying trauma of grief. He fainted, remained inconsolable for weeks, and paced his room, refusing to speak. He rode his horse into the woods for hours, aimless and wild with sorrow. On her deathbed, Martha had made him promise one thing. She had seen the cruelty of stepmothers in other families and asked him never to marry again. Jefferson promised, and he kept that word. This promise is the key that unlocks the door to the future tragedy involving Sally Hemings. By swearing never to remarry, Jefferson condemned himself to a life of romantic isolation. He was a man of high passions, who adored the company of women and needed domestic intimacy. Yet, he had locked the front door of legitimate marriage forever. He was now a widower, 40 years old, sitting in a half-finished house that echoed with the memories of his dead wife, drowning in the whale's debt that had ballooned during the war. He was lonely, depressed, and financially underwater. The walls of Monticello, which were supposed to be his sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. He needed to escape. He needed a change of scenery to run away from the grief and the creditors. In 1784, the lifeline appeared when Congress asked him to go to Paris to serve as a diplomat alongside Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. Jefferson grabbed the opportunity with the desperation of a drowning man. Paris was the city of light, of philosophy, of books, and of architecture, the spiritual home he had always longed for. He packed his trunks, took his eldest daughter, Martha, and left the younger children behind. Crucially, he also left the ledgers behind, instructing his agent to manage the farms and pay the debts if possible. But his mind was already across the Atlantic. He was running away from his reality. When Thomas Jefferson boarded the ship Ceres in Boston Harbor in July 1784, he was a man in a dangerous state of mind. He was emotionally hollowed out and craving comfort, financially insolvent, yet accustomed to living like a prince, and possessed of a massive capacity for denial. He was sailing toward the epicenter of luxury, the court of Louis XVI, a place of silks, gilded mirrors, and moral laxity. He was a recovering addict walking into an opium den, and he was traveling alone. But soon he would send for his younger daughter, Polly, and accompanying Polly would be a servant, a teenage girl chosen for her reliability and her light skin, a girl named Sally Hemings. The stage was set, the fatal flaw established, and the heir of illusions was about to become the merchant of Paris, trading his financial future for a few years of bliss and his moral soul for a shadow family. In the summer of 1784, Thomas Jefferson arrived in Paris, and the psychological dam that had been holding back his desires finally burst. If Virginia was a land of constraints, constrained by debt, by grief, by the provincial nature of colonial life, France was a universe of absolute intoxicating indulgence. Jefferson stepped off the carriage and into a world that seemed designed specifically to seduce him. It was the twilight of the Ancien Regime, the final glittering decade before the guillotine would sever the heads of the aristocracy. And the city was awash in the very things Jefferson craved: art, science, music, and an obsession with material beauty. He was supposed to be a diplomat representing a bankrupt, fledgling republic of farmers. Instead, he began to live like a duke. The transformation was immediate and total. The frugal impulses he preached in his letters home evaporated in the perfumed air of the salons. He rented the Hôtel de Langeac, a palatial residence on the Champs-Élysées. It was far too large and far too expensive for his salary, but he justified it as a necessity of his office. He convinced himself that to gain respect for America, he had to dine and dress like a European aristocrat. This was the lie he told the government. The truth was that he was feeding the hunger that had started with the Shadwell fire. He began a shopping spree that would last for 5 years and haunt him for the rest of his life. He did not just buy, he consumed. He hired a battalion of servants, including a chef, a coachman, a gardener, and a valet. He bought a carriage, he bought horses, and then the objects began to flow in. He haunted the auction houses and the bookshops along the Seine. He bought 2,000 books, tripling the size of his library. He bought scientific instruments, telescopes, thermometers, hygrometers, convinced that measuring the world was the same as controlling it. He bought furniture, 86 crates of it, damask chairs, marble-topped tables, gold leaf mirrors. He bought statues, he bought paintings, and he bought clothes. The raw-boned Virginian, who had arrived in homespun wool, began to appear in silk waistcoats, ruffled shirts, and elegant breeches. But his most dangerous purchase was wine. In Virginia, wine was a luxury. In Paris, it was a religion, and Jefferson became its most devout convert. He traveled to the vineyards of Bordeaux and Burgundy. He didn't just buy bottles, he bought casks. He ordered hundreds of bottles of Chateau Margaux, Chateau d'Yquem, and Chambertin. He meticulously recorded every sou he spent in his account books, deluding himself that recording the expenditure was the same as managing it. It was not. He was spending his salary, his private income, and loans he secured from Dutch bankers. He was digging a hole so deep that the light of solvency was disappearing. But he didn't care. He was happy. For the first time since Martha's death, the void was being filled. Then, in 1787, the human element of his tragedy arrived. Jefferson had sent for his younger daughter, Polly, to join him in Paris. She arrived in London first, accompanied by a teenage enslaved girl chosen by the family back in Virginia for her maturity and reliability. The girl's name was Sally Hemings. When Jefferson traveled to London to retrieve his daughter and saw the girl, the shock must have been visceral. Sally Hemings was not just a servant. She was roughly 14 to 16 years old. She was described by contemporaries as mighty near white and very handsome, with long, straight hair down her back. But the most terrifying detail for Jefferson was her lineage. She was the half-sister of his dead wife, Martha. She carried the whale's blood. In her face, in her gestures, in the timbre of her voice, Jefferson saw a ghost. He saw the woman he had promised never to replace, reincarnated in the body of a girl he owned. They returned to Paris, and Sally was installed in the Hôtel de Langeac. It is here, in the heart of the most liberal city in the world, that the great paradox of Jefferson's life tightened its grip. In France, there was a legal principle known as the freedom principle. There are no slaves in France. Any enslaved person who set foot on French soil could petition for their freedom and would be granted it immediately. Jefferson knew this. He was a lawyer. He knew that the moment Sally Hemings walked through the gates of Paris, his legal hold over her evaporated. She was, for all intents and purposes, free, yet she stayed. For 2 years she lived in his house. Why? The relationship that developed between the 44-year-old diplomat and the teenage girl has been the subject of 2 centuries of debate, denial, and romanticization. But if we strip away the myths, we are left with a situation of profound power imbalance and complex coercion. Jefferson began to pay her a small wage, a monthly allowance of 12 livres. It was not a salary, it was pocket money, a token. He bought her clothes, fine French clothes that allowed her to blend in with the servants of the aristocracy. She was tutored in French. She was treated not as a field hand, but as a lady's maid, a role that placed her in the intimate sphere of his bedroom and his private life. Historians have argued over whether it was love or rape. In the context of the 18th century and the ownership of one human by another, Consent is a shattered concept. But what is certain is that Jefferson found in Sally a loophole to his vow of celibacy. She was the sister of his wife, yet she was property. She was a connection to his past happiness, yet she had no legal standing to demand the rights of a wife. She was the perfect solution for a man who wanted intimacy without the social obligations of marriage. But Sally Hemings was not a passive victim. She was a Hemings. She was intelligent, observant, and aware of her surroundings. She saw free black people in Paris. She saw a society where her color did not condemn her to the fields. She realized she had leverage. The crisis came in 1789. The French Revolution was beginning to boil over. The Bastille had fallen. Jefferson was preparing to return to America to become the first Secretary of State under George Washington. He packed his 86 crates of furniture, he packed his books, he packed his wine, and he told Sally to pack her trunk. She refused. This is the pivotal moment of the entire story, the moment the silent girl found her voice. According to the oral history passed down through her son, Madison Hemings, a testimony that has proven more accurate than the official histories, Sally told Jefferson she would not go back. She knew that if she returned to Virginia, she would return to being a slave. She would be property again. Her children would be born slaves. She threatened to stay in France, where the law would protect her. Jefferson was terrified. He could not drag her onto the ship in chains. It would cause a scandal that would destroy his political career. He could not leave her behind. She was pregnant with his child. He was trapped. The master was at the mercy of the slave. So he negotiated. The author of the Declaration of Independence sat down with a pregnant teenage girl and hammered out a contract. It was a deal made in the shadows, unwritten but binding. Sally laid out her terms. She would return to America. She would return to the cage. She would resume her role as his servant and his mistress. But there was a price. The price was her children. She demanded that any children born of their union would be freed when they reached the age of 21. It was a staggering demand. She was sacrificing her own freedom, her one chance to live as a free woman in Europe, to secure the freedom of unborn generations. She was making a bet on the future. She was betting that Jefferson, for all his flaws, was a man who kept his word to his own blood. Jefferson agreed. He had no choice. He promised extraordinary privileges for her at Monticello and freedom for their children. The deal was struck. In October 1789, Thomas Jefferson, his daughters, and a pregnant Sally Hemings boarded the ship Clermont bound for Virginia. The 86 crates of furniture were in the hold. The wine was safely stowed. And in the cabin the secret family was already forming. When the ship docked in Norfolk, Virginia, the freedom principle vanished. The moment Sally's foot touched American soil, the invisible chain snapped back on. She was no longer Mademoiselle Hemings of Paris. She was Sally, the property of Thomas Jefferson, value $50. But she carried a secret victory in her womb. Jefferson returned to America not as a solvent man, but as a debtor on a colossal scale. The 5 years in Paris had ruined him. He had spent his salary, his savings, and his credit. He returned with a lifestyle he could not sustain and a hidden family he could not acknowledge. He brought back the statues and the silk, but he also brought back a moral cancer that would eat away at his legacy. He arrived at Monticello 2 days before Christmas in 1789. The slaves cheered his return, unhitching the horses and pulling the carriage up the mountain by hand. They thought the good master was back. They did not know that he had just signed away the labor of the next generation to pay for the crates that were following him up the hill. The bargain was sealed. Sally would live in the shadows. She would bear him 6 children. She would watch them grow up in the house of their father, waiting for the clock to tick down to their 21st birthdays. And Jefferson? He would spend the next 36 years trying to pretend that the beautiful, orderly world he created at Monticello was not built on a lie. He had brought the elegance of Paris to the wilderness, but he had paid for it with his soul. When Thomas Jefferson returned to Virginia in 1789, he did not come home to find peace. He came home to find a mistake. He stood on the lawn of Monticello, the house he had built with such pride in his 20s, and he looked at it with the eyes of a man who had seen the Pantheon in Rome and the Hôtel de Salm in Paris. What he saw made him recoil. The old Monticello was too small, it was too provincial, it was too American. To his radicalized aesthetic sense, it looked like the home of a farmer, not a philosopher. And so, almost immediately upon his return, he made a decision that would doom his finances for the next 4 decades. He decided to tear it down. He did not just renovate. He engaged in an act of architectural violence. He ordered the roof to be ripped off. He ordered walls to be smashed. He ordered the utter destruction of the existing second floor. For the next 20 years, the Little Mountain was not a quiet sanctuary of thought. It was a chaotic, deafening industrial zone. It was a place of red dust, shattered bricks, and the constant rhythmic hammering of enslaved carpenters. Jefferson did not live in a house, he lived in a construction site, and he dragged his family into the rubble with him. This was not a renovation for comfort, it was a renovation for ego. Jefferson had brought the virus of European architecture back across the Atlantic, and it had mutated into an obsession. He wanted a dome. The dome room of Monticello is the perfect symbol of Jefferson's tragic flaw. It is the architectural manifestation of his ability to prioritize the abstract over the practical, the beautiful over the solvent. He spent a fortune constructing it. It required complicated engineering, expensive materials, and the most skilled labor his workforce could provide. It was modeled after the Temple of Vesta in Rome. It was breathtaking. It was magnificent. And it was completely useless. The dome room was difficult to access, freezing cold in the winter and suffocatingly hot in the summer. It was a folly, a piece of architecture that exists solely to be looked at. Jefferson rarely used it. His family almost never entered it. Yet, to build this empty temple in the sky, he mortgaged the earth beneath it. Every brick in that dome represented a loan from a bank. Every pane of glass represented a bill he delayed paying. But the most sinister aspect of the new Monticello was not the dome. It was the machinery of invisibility. Jefferson returned from France with a new desire: privacy. In Europe, he had seen how the aristocracy lived, surrounded by servants, yet seemingly alone. He wanted the service without the sight of the servants. He wanted the magic of a glass of wine appearing at his elbow, without having to make eye contact with the human being who poured it. He wanted to enjoy the fruits of slavery without having to look at the slaves. So he designed the house to erase them. He installed dumbwaiters, small mechanical elevators built into the sides of the fireplaces in the dining room. These allowed wine bottles to be hoisted up from the cellar directly to the host's hand. He designed a revolving serving door with shelves. The enslaved cooks in the kitchen would place the hot food on the shelves and spin the door. On the other side, inside the dining room, the food would magically appear. To the guests dining with the president, it was a marvel of ingenuity. It was modern. It was efficient. But psychologically, it was a mechanism of denial. It allowed Jefferson to sit at his table, discussing the rights of man and the evils of tyranny, while the black hands that cooked his food and poured his wine were literally walled off from his vision. He constructed a physical architecture that supported his moral blindness. He built a machine to help him forget that he was a slave owner. But if the house was designed to hide the slavery, the mountain itself was designed to enforce it. To pay for the dome, the wine, and the endless renovations, Jefferson needed cash. Tobacco was failing. The soil was exhausted. He needed a new industry. He turned to manufacturing. He looked at the young boys on the plantation, the sons of the field hands, the children of the women who dusted his books, and he saw a workforce. He built the nailery. The nailery was situated on Mulberry Row, the industrial spine of the plantation, just a few hundred yards from the mansion. It was a long, dark shed filled with forges. It was the heart of darkness on the mountain. Here, boys aged 10 to 16 spent their days swinging hammers. They were not learning a trade for their own future. They were human machines turning iron rods into nails. Jefferson calculated their output with chilling precision. He weighed the iron in the morning and weighed the nails in the evening. He knew exactly how much profit each boy produced per day. In his letters, the philosopher vanishes and the factory manager appears. He wrote, "My nailers provide for my groceries." The equation was simple. The sweat of the boys paid for the beef and the wine on the master's table. The discipline in the nailery was brutal. Jefferson abhorred the sight of violence, so he rarely whipped slaves himself. He delegated the cruelty. He hired overseers, men like William McGehee and Gabriel Lilly, to extract the maximum production. When the boys slowed down, the whip cracked. We know the story of Jimmy Hubbard. He was a young enslaved man working in the nailery. He was resistant. He was bad. He ran away. When he was caught and brought back, Jefferson did not weep for his lost freedom. He ordered him to be punished. In the ledger of Monticello, a boy who refused to make nails was a broken tool that needed to be fixed or discarded. This is the monstrous paradox at the heart of Monticello. While Jefferson was sitting in his library, designing the University of Virginia and writing letters about the illimitable freedom of the human mind, the sound of the hammers from the nailery would have been audible through the window. Clang, 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 the rhythm of his wealth. He could not hear the screams of the boys under the overseer's lash, or perhaps he chose to interpret it as the noise of industry. The renovation of Monticello lasted for nearly 40 years. It was never truly finished. It was a beast that was always hungry. As soon as one wing was completed, the roof of another would begin to leak. As soon as the floor was laid, the style would go out of fashion. Jefferson was trapped in a cycle of unbuilding and rebuilding. The house began to consume the people. To pay for the skilled joiners and the expensive materials, Jefferson had to mortgage more slaves. He had to sell land. The architectural monster was eating the estate alive. And inside this monster, the shadow family was growing. Sally Hemings was living in the South Pavilion and later in a room under the South Terrace. It was a room that was physically connected to the main house by a covered passageway, yet hidden from the public view. It was the perfect architectural metaphor for their relationship, connected but underground. During these years of construction, Sally gave birth to the children who were promised freedom: Harriet, Beverly, then 2 daughters who died in infancy, then Madison, then Eston. They grew up in the dust of the construction site. They watched their father direct the workmen. They saw him obsess over the shape of a column or the color of a brick. Did they know that the cost of that column was their own labor? Did they understand that the beautiful cage being built around them was paid for by the servitude of their cousins in the nailery? The children of Sally Hemings occupied a bizarre liminal space in this architectural hierarchy. They were not sent to the nailery. They were spared the brutalization of the fields. They were kept close to the house. They were light work servants. This was the extraordinary privilege Jefferson had promised in Paris, but it was a fragile privilege. They were still listed in the inventory. They were still property. As the house grew grander, the debts grew deeper. By 1800, Jefferson was elected President of the United States. He was the most powerful man in the New World. But back at Monticello, he was a man losing control. The mansion was a beautiful shell, a facade of Republican virtue masking a core of feudal tyranny and financial ruin. He invited the world to come and see it. Visitors flocked to the little mountain. They marveled at the dome. They admired the revolving door. They complimented the wine. They wrote glowing letters about the sage who lived in such harmony with nature. They did not look down at Mulberry Row. They did not ask where the nails came from. They did not ask why the maid who dusted the guest room looked so much like the president. They accepted the illusion because it was beautiful, and because to question it would be to question the foundation of their own society. Thomas Jefferson had succeeded in building his monument. He had created a masterpiece of American architecture, but he had built it on a sinkhole. And as the 19th century dawned, the ground began to shift. The architectural monster was finished feeding on the bricks and mortar. Now it was ready to start feeding on the future of the family itself. While the hammers of the nailery rang out in the valley and the dome rose slowly into the Virginia sky, a different kind of construction was taking place inside the domestic sphere of Monticello. It was the construction of a lie. For 30 years, Thomas Jefferson lived inside a paradox that would have shattered a lesser mind. He presided over a household that contained two distinct families. One was white, legitimate, and celebrated, the family of his daughter Martha Randolph. The other was enslaved, illegitimate, and hidden in plain sight. His 4 children, who survived to adulthood, Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Sally Hemings. They are the ghosts of the Jefferson legacy, the living evidence of his secret life. But to call them hidden is not entirely accurate. They were not locked in a cellar. They were not sent away to a distant farm. They were right there. They were everywhere. They opened the doors for guests. They dusted the furniture. They tuned the violins. They were the shadow family, occupying a strange liminal space between servitude and kinship. The most terrifying and undeniable aspect of these children was their faces. Genetics is a cruel auditor. It keeps a record that cannot be erased by social convention. Sally Hemings herself was the daughter of John Wales, Jefferson's father-in-law, making her half white. Thomas Jefferson was white. Therefore, their children were 7/8 white. By the legal definitions of the time, and certainly by visual inspection, they were white. Imagine the scene in the parlor of Monticello. A guest arrives, perhaps a diplomat from Europe or a politician from Richmond. He is greeted by a young house servant. The servant has reddish-gray hair. He has a freckled complexion. He has a long, aquiline nose and a tall, angular frame. He looks exactly like the President of the United States in miniature. The guest blinks. He looks at the master, then back at the servant. The resemblance is not just passing, it is absolute. It is a living mirror walking around the room, serving tea. Yet the code of the Virginia aristocracy demanded silence. To speak of it was to break the spell. Guests would whisper in their diaries about the yellow children at Monticello, but no one dared confront the sage. They participated in a collective hallucination, pretending that these children were just light-skinned strangers who happened to be born on the mountain. For the children themselves, life at Monticello was a psychological labyrinth. They knew who their father was. It was an open secret in the slave quarters. Sally Shirley told them, The other enslaved people treated them with a specific deference mixed with pity. They were massa's blood, but Jefferson never acknowledged them, not once. There is no record of him ever holding them, bouncing them on his knee, or reading them a bedtime story. There is no letter where he refers to them as my son or my daughter. To him, in the cold, hard ledger of his mind, they were servants. He categorized them in his farm book not under family, but under property. However, his actions betrayed a different truth. He kept his promise to Sally, but he did it with a cold, detached efficiency. He shielded them from the brutality of the institution. Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston were never sent to the fields. They never felt the bite of the overseer's whip. They were never forced to work in the nailery alongside the other boys. Instead, they were given an education of sorts. They were trained in the gentle trades. The boys were trained as carpenters and joiners, working with fine wood, learning the skills that would allow them to earn a living as free men. Harriet was trained in weaving and textile management. They were allowed to run about the house and the grounds more freely than other enslaved children. They grew up listening to the music of the violin, the conversation of philosophers, and the French language spoken by their mother. But this privilege was a trap. They were raised in the presence of their father, yet separated from him by an invisible canyon of race and law. Imagine the confusion of young Madison Hemings. He sees the white grandchildren, Jefferson's legitimate heirs, playing on the lawn. They run to the old man, they hug him, they call him Grandpapa. Madison stands 10 feet away holding a tray. He shares the same blood, he shares the same face, but he must stand still. He must be silent. He must wait for an order, not a hug. Jefferson's behavior toward them was described by Madison years later in his memoirs. He said Jefferson was kind, but not affectionate. He was distant. He was like a benevolent uncle who is taken in a charity case, rather than a father raising his own flesh and blood. This detachment was Jefferson's defense mechanism. If he allowed himself to love them openly, the entire edifice of his life would crumble. If he loved them, how could he own them? If he loved them, how could he justify the fact that their mother had no legal rights? So, he froze his heart. He treated them as projects rather than people. The contrast between the two families living under one roof was starkest in the dining room. At dinner, Jefferson would sit at the head of the table. His daughter Martha, tall, severe, the mistress of the house, sat opposite him. Serving the food were the Hemings men. Martha looked at these servants and saw the living proof of her father's betrayal of her mother's memory. She saw her own half-siblings and her own nephews and nieces in bondage. The tension between Martha Randolph and Sally Hemings is one of the great untold stories of Monticello. They were the two matriarchs of the mountain. One had the name, the other had the intimacy. Martha struggled to manage a household that was crumbling under debt, trying to keep up appearances. Sally lived in the shadows, raising children who were destined to leave. Did they speak? Did they argue? Or did they maintain a stony silence, navigating around each other in the corridors, united only by their dependence on the same failing man? As the children grew older, the tragedy of their existence deepened. They were white children, trapped in a legal fiction of blackness. They knew that when they reached the age of 21, the promise of Paris was supposed to activate, but they also watched the creditors arriving. They saw the stress on their father's face. They knew the estate was bleeding money. The fear must have been constant. What if he dies before we are 21? If Jefferson died while they were still minors, they would be liquidated along with the furniture. The promise was only good as long as the master was alive. Every cough from the old man, every bout of illness, must have sent a shiver of terror through the Hemings cabin. They were betting their lives on the longevity of an old man in failing health. And what of Sally? She was the anchor in this storm. She was the one who kept them clean, kept them polite, and kept them prepared. She was raising them not to be slaves, but to be free people in waiting. She had to teach them the hardest lesson of all. You are special, but you are not safe. You are his children, but you are not his heirs. By the 1820s, the oldest children, Beverly and Harriet, were entering adulthood. They were indistinguishable from white people. Harriet was described as incredibly beautiful, nearly white, with long, straight hair. She worked in the textile shop, spinning wool. Beverly was a musician and a carpenter. The moment of truth was approaching. The debt collectors were circling. Jefferson was desperate for cash. A slave like Harriet, young, beautiful, skilled, light-skinned, would fetch a premium price at auction. She was worth hundreds of dollars. Selling her could pay the interest on a loan for a few months. This was the test of Thomas Jefferson's soul. Would he succumb to the financial pressure and monetize his own daughter? Or would he honor the shadowy contract he made in a Paris hotel room 30 years ago? The Shadow family waited. They watched the master's pen hover over the ledger. They knew that their bodies were the only currency he had left. The house was eating their future, and the father they could not name held the knife. In 1801, Thomas Jefferson ascended to the highest office in the land. He became the third president of the United States. His inauguration was a piece of carefully choreographed theater. Unlike his predecessors, Washington and Adams, who rode in carriages and wore ceremonial swords, Jefferson walked to the Capitol. He wore plain clothes. He shook hands instead of bowing. He presented himself to the world as the avatar of the common man, the champion of Republican simplicity. But behind the closed doors of the president's house, the common man was living with the extravagance of a Bourbon monarch. The tragedy of Jefferson's presidency is not political, it is financial. For 8 years, he treated the federal budget with scrupulous, penny-pinching care, slashing national debt and reducing the size of the government. Yet simultaneously, he treated his personal budget with reckless abandon. He created a bifurcation in his mind, the public steward versus the private aristocrat. The trap was the dining table. Jefferson believed that governance happened not on the floor of Congress, but over dinner. He abolished the formal levees of the Federalist era and replaced them with intimate dinners. These were not potlucks. These were masterpieces of culinary diplomacy, prepared by French-trained chefs and lubricated with the finest wines on earth. He invited friends and enemies alike to sit at his table, believing that the oil of wine could smooth the friction of politics. It worked politically, but financially it was a massacre. The president's salary was $25,000 a year. It was a handsome sum, a fortune by the standards of the day. But Jefferson was spending it faster than it arrived. He had to pay for the staff, the food, the ice, the horses, and the decorations out of his own pocket. And then there was the wine. During his 2 terms, Jefferson spent approximately $10,000 on wine alone. In modern purchasing power, this is comparable to spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on alcohol. He didn't just drink it, he studied it, he curated it, he obsessed over it. He imported Nebbiolo from Piedmont, Hermitage from the Rhone, and Sherry from Spain. He was the most knowledgeable wine connoisseur in America, but he was drinking his own solvency. He kept meticulous records. This is the maddening paradox of Jefferson the debtor. He was not careless with the recording of money. He was careless with the reality of it. He wrote down every cent he spent on peas, on strawberries, on candles. His account books are masterpieces of data, but he refused to look at the bottom line. He suffered from a specific form of aristocrat's blindness, the belief that settling up was something that happened in the distant future. He viewed debt not as a crisis, but as a gentleman's fluctuating account balance. When he left the presidency in 1809, he didn't leave with a surplus. He left with $11,000 in new debt. He had worked the hardest job in the world for 8 years and had paid for the privilege of doing so. He rode back to Monticello not as a conquering hero returning to his estate, but as a fugitive returning to his hideout. He believed that retirement would save him. He told his overseers, he told his daughter, and most importantly, he told himself, "And now I will turn to farming. The earth will repay me." It was a delusion. The soil of Virginia was exhausted. The price of tobacco was crashing. The wheat crops were vulnerable to the Hessian fly. Monticello was not a profit center. It was a money pit. The nailery was barely breaking even. The loom house was producing cloth only for the slaves, generating no cash. Yet the spending did not stop. It shifted. In retirement, Jefferson became the sage of Monticello. And a sage needs an audience. The crowds began to arrive. They came in carriages, on horses, and on foot. They were strangers, admirers, politicians, and curiosity seekers. They wanted to see the man who wrote the Declaration. They wanted to see the dome. And by the laws of Virginia hospitality, Jefferson could not turn them away. Monticello became a hotel where the guests never paid. He fed them. He housed them. He poured them the expensive wine he could no longer afford. His daughter Martha was driven to the brink of a nervous breakdown, trying to manage the influx. She once ordered the butcher to cut the meat into smaller portions because there were 50 guests for dinner and not enough beef. The house was being eaten alive by its own fame. And then the trap snapped shut. It happened in 1818. The cause was friendship, honor, and financial suicide. Wilson Carey Nicholas was a close friend of Jefferson, a former governor of Virginia, and a member of the inner circle. Nicholas was in trouble. He needed a loan. He needed a co-signer, a man of impeccable reputation to guarantee his debt to the Bank of the United States. He came to Monticello and asked Jefferson to sign 2 promissory notes totaling $20,000. Jefferson knew his own finances were precarious. He knew he was technically insolvent, but he was a gentleman. In his code of honor, you did not refuse a friend. You did not admit you were broke. To refuse would be to reveal the shame of his own poverty. So he signed, he put his name, the most famous name in America, on the line. He believed it was a formality. He believed Nicholas was good for the money. He was wrong. In 1819, the American economy collapsed. It was the panic of 1819, the first great financial depression of the United States. Land values plummeted, banks failed, credit dried up, Wilson Carey Nicholas went bankrupt. And then he died. The Bank of the United States did not care about friendship. They turned their eyes to the co-signer. They turned to Thomas Jefferson. Suddenly, the debt was not theoretical. It was real. It was immediate. And it was $20,000 added on top of the debts he already owed to his British creditors and local merchants. The impact was physical. When Jefferson heard the news of Nicholas's death and the calling of the notes, his health collapsed. He suffered from severe diarrhea, a symptom of extreme stress. He realized finally that there was no way out. The walls of his library, the columns of his portico, the very beds his family slept in, it was all compromised. This is the moment the philosopher died and the debtor took over completely. The last 7 years of his life were a humiliation. He spent his days writing desperate letters, calculating interest, and trying to hide the truth from the public. He was a man who had purchased the Louisiana Territory, doubling the size of the nation for $15 million. But he could not find $20,000 to save his own home. He began to sell things. He sold his second library to Congress to replace the one burned by the British in 1814. He received $23,950 for the books. It was a lifeline. He thought it would clear his debts, but the money vanished instantly. It went to the creditors, and it barely covered the interest. The principal remained, a black mountain that cast a shadow over everything. And in the shadows, the Shadow family watched. Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston. They were young adults now. They saw the stress on their father's face. They saw the letters from the sheriff. They understood the implication. If the bank foreclosed, the property would be seized. And they were the property. The debt created a terrifying timeline. Jefferson was racing against his own mortality. If he died while the debt was this high, the estate would be auctioned immediately. His death would be the starting gun for their enslavement. This pressure cooker atmosphere brings us to the most heartbreaking chapter of the story. The moment where the benevolent father had to make a choice. He could not free them legally because the law said a debtor could not give away assets, but he could not sell them because they were his blood. So he orchestrated a theft. He decided to let his own assets steal themselves. He prepared to enact the final clause of the Paris contract, not with a triumphant signature, but with a silent nod to the back door. By 1822, the atmosphere at Monticello had shifted from anxiety to a quiet, suffocating dread. The little mountain was no longer a place of celebration. It was a fortress under siege by invisible armies of interest and principle. Thomas Jefferson was 79 years old. His hands, crippled by rheumatism and an old wrist injury, could barely hold a quill for long periods. Yet his mind remained sharp, painfully aware of the trap closing around him. He knew the end was coming. He knew the creditors were waiting for his last breath to descend upon the estate, and he knew that when they did, they would not distinguish between a mahogany table and a human being. This reality brought the Shadow family into the crosshairs. The children of Sally Hemings were no longer children. Beverly was 24, Harriet was 21, Madison was 17, Eston was 14. They were prime assets. In the cold calculus of the slave market, a skilled carpenter like Beverly or a young light-skinned woman like Harriet represented the most valuable items on the plantation. They were the liquid assets that could save the estate for the legitimate white family. But there was the promise, the Treaty of Paris. The vow made to a pregnant teenage girl 30 years ago that her children would walk free at 21. Now, the bill for that promise was due, but Jefferson faced a legal and financial impossibility. He could not legally free them. The laws of Virginia had tightened like a noose. A law passed in 1806 required that any freed slave must leave the state of Virginia within 1 year or face reenslavement. To free them was to banish them from their home and their mother. Furthermore, the law of insolvency prohibited a debtor from giving away valuable property. If Jefferson formally freed Beverly or Harriet, his creditors could sue him for giving away their collateral. He was legally blocked from being a father. So Thomas Jefferson, the great architect, designed one final intricate structure. He designed a disappearance. It began with Beverly Hemings. He was the eldest. He was a musician, often playing the violin alongside his brother Eston at dances. He was described as white by everyone who saw him. He moved with the confidence of a man who knew his lineage. In early 1822, Beverly simply vanished. There was no announcement. There was no manumission paper signed in the courthouse. He walked away from Monticello. He slipped out of the orbit of slavery and into the vast anonymous world of white America. Usually, when a valuable slave ran away, the master would unleash the machinery of retrieval. He would place advertisements in the Richmond Enquirer. He would offer a reward, $10, for the return of my property. He would send slave patrollers with dogs. For Beverly Hemings, there was silence. Jefferson did not place an ad. He did not send a sheriff. He simply noted in his farm book, with a terrifying bureaucratic neutrality, the word runaway. It was a lie recorded for history, a fiction to satisfy the creditors. I did not give him away, he stole himself, but it was a sanctioned theft. It was a gentleman's escape. Beverly vanished into the mist, crossing the color line, never to be seen at Monticello again. He married a white woman of good family in Maryland. He lived the rest of his life as a white man, bearing his past, bearing his mother's name, bearing the truth of his existence to survive. 2 years later, in 1824, the drama repeated itself, but with even higher stakes. It was Harriet's turn. Harriet Hemings was 23 years old. She was the only surviving daughter of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. She was the only female enslaved person Thomas Jefferson ever allowed to escape in his entire lifetime. Think of the hundreds of women he owned, aunts, cousins, grandmothers. Only Harriet was allowed to leave. The preparation for her departure reveals the depth of the collusion between the master and the slave. Harriet worked in the textile shop, overseeing the spinning and weaving. She was integral to the household. Yet, in the months leading up to her 21st birthday, she was not working. She was preparing. Jefferson's granddaughter, Ellen Randolph, later recalled the event with a mixture of bitterness and confusion. She remembered that her grandfather seemed to be equipping Harriet. He did not just open the door, he financed the journey. He gave her $50. $50. In 1824, $50 was a fortune for a farm laborer. It was more cash than most people at Monticello saw in a lifetime. At a time when Jefferson was struggling to pay his own grocery bills, when he was begging friends for loans, he found $50 to put into the hand of this enslaved woman. Why? Because $50 was the price of a stagecoach ticket to the North. It was the price of a new wardrobe. It was the seed money for a new identity. The day of her departure was a scene of devastating, silent tragedy. Imagine the moment. The carriage is waiting, perhaps down the road, away from the prying eyes of the neighbors. Harriet is dressed not in the rough Osnaburg linen of a slave, but in the fine clothes of a traveling lady. She stands before her mother, Sally. This is the price of the Treaty of Paris. This is the moment Sally Hemings had bargained for 30 years ago. She had stayed in bondage so that this moment could happen. But the victory tasted like ash. To be free, Harriet had to die to her family. To survive in the North, she would have to pass as a white woman. She could never mention Monticello. She could never mention her mother. If she wrote a letter, it could expose her. If she visited, she could be captured. The embrace between mother and daughter was a finality. Harriet was not just leaving home, she was exiting their reality. She was stepping through a mirror. She climbed into the stagecoach. She sat among white passengers. She spoke with the diction she had learned in the corridors of the president's house. She traveled north, likely to Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia, and she disappeared. Like her brother Beverly, she melted into the white population. She married a white man. She raised white children. Her descendants alive today likely spent generations not knowing that their great-great-grandmother was an enslaved woman born on a mountain in Virginia, or that their great-great-grandfather was the author of the Declaration of Independence. Back at Monticello, Jefferson returned to his ledger. Beside the name Harriet, he wrote the same lie, runaway. The brutality of this benevolence is staggering. Jefferson gave them freedom, yes, but he gave them a freedom that required the amputation of their identity. He did not have the courage to stand up to his society, to his creditors, or to his legitimate family and say, "These are my children, and I acknowledge them." Instead, he pushed them out the back door with a handful of cash and a lifetime of secrets. He made them fugitives in their own country. The house was quieter now. Beverly and Harriet were ghosts. Only Madison and Eston remained. Madison and Eston were younger. They were staying. They had not yet reached the age of 21, and perhaps the bond with their mother was too strong to break, or perhaps Jefferson needed them too much. Eston was a master carpenter. Madison was a skilled joiner. As the house crumbled, their labor was essential to keep the roof from falling in. For the next 2 years, the three of them, Sally, Madison, and Eston, lived in the shrinking shadow of the old man. They watched him decline. They saw the desperation in his eyes as he tried to organize a lottery to save the estate. Jefferson petitioned the Virginia legislature to allow him to raffle off his land, a humiliating final attempt to pay his debts without selling the people. "It is a cruel necessity," he wrote. He pleaded with the public to buy tickets to save the sage. But the lottery failed. The public did not care enough. The debts were too vast. By the spring of 1826, the end game had arrived. The two older children were gone, living as white people in a world that would lynch them if it knew the truth. The two younger sons were waiting, watching the clock, wondering if the old man would die before he could sign the papers for them. And Sally Hemings waited. She had sent 2 of her hearts into the void. She had 2 left. She sat in her room in the south wing, listening to the labored breathing of the man upstairs. She had been his property, his mistress, his chambermaid, and the mother of his children. She had given him everything. Now she was waiting to see if he would honor the final payment. Here is the final cruelty. A father who could only be a father in secret. He saved his children by banishing them. He saved them by turning them into strangers. It was a solution born of cowardice and love, twisted together until they could not be separated. As July 1826 approached, the Shadow family braced for the impact. They knew what the White family did not want to admit. The death of Thomas Jefferson would not be a state funeral. It would be a foreclosure. Winter came to Monticello with a vengeance in 1827. The warmth of the July Jubilee was a distant memory, replaced by the biting cold of January winds that whipped around the mountaintop. The house, once the vibrant center of American intellectual life, stood silent and shivering. The blinds were drawn. The fires in the great fireplaces burned low to conserve wood. Thomas Jefferson had been in his grave for 6 months, and the protection his name provided had finally expired. The executors had done the math. The lottery had failed. The subscriptions had failed. There was no other way. The notices were printed in the Richmond Enquirer and posted on courthouse doors across the county. They were stark, brutal advertisements that signaled the end of the empire. They announced an executor's sale. On January 15, 1827, the crowds returned to the little mountain. But this time, they did not come as pilgrims to see the sage. They came as shoppers to pick over the bones. They came in wagons and carriages, muddying the pristine gravel paths Jefferson had designed with such care. They were slave traders from Georgia, farmers from the valley, and university students looking for a bargain. The atmosphere was not one of reverence. It was the coarse, loud atmosphere of a market day. The auction began with the goods. The material debris of Jefferson's obsession was dragged out onto the lawn. The furniture he had brought from Paris, the scientific instruments he had used to measure the stars, the farm tools he had invented, all of it was knocked down to the highest bidder. The sheer volume of things was staggering. a physical testament to the spending addiction that had hollowed out the estate. But the furniture was just the appetizer. The crowd was waiting for the main course. Standing in the freezing mud, huddled together against the cold and the terror, were more than 100 human beings. These were not strangers. These were the Monticello family. They were men and women who had been born on this mountain, who had built the house, cooked the meals, and nursed the children. They had lived under the delusion, fostered by Jefferson himself, that they were part of a benevolent patriarchy. They believed that they were different from the slaves on other plantations. But on this Monday morning, the illusion was shattered by the crack of the auctioneer's gavel. The sale of the people was the final betrayal. It was the moment where the moral debt and the financial debt converged. The auction block was set up, likely near the carpentry shop or the overseer's house. One by one, the people were called up. Families were ripped apart in seconds. A husband was sold to a trader heading to Mississippi, while his wife was sold to a local farmer. Children were separated from their parents. The cries of the separated families echoed off the neoclassical columns of the mansion, a sound of raw human anguish that drowned out the memory of the violin music that used to float from the parlor. The tragedy of Joe Fawcett is the most piercing example of this cruelty. Fawcett was the master blacksmith, the head of the nailery, and one of the 5 men freed in Jefferson's will. He was technically a free man on the day of the auction, but his freedom was a curse, for his wife Edith and their 7 children were not free. They were on the block. Fawcett watched in helpless agony as his family was sold away to different buyers. He spent the rest of his life working tirelessly at his forge, saving every penny to buy them back one by one. He was a man freed by the master, but enslaved by the master's debt. And where was the shadow family during this apocalypse? Sally Hemings did not stand on the auction block. She was 54 years old. She was not formally freed in the will. Jefferson had been too cautious, or perhaps too legally bound, to do that. Instead, she was given her time by Jefferson's daughter, Martha. This was an unofficial freedom, a quiet arrangement that allowed her to live as a free woman without the legal paperwork that would force her to leave the state. It was a final face-saving gesture from the White family. They could not sell the mother of their own uncle, nor could they acknowledge her. So they let her fade away. Madison and Eston Hemings, now free men according to the will, left the mountain. They took their mother with them. They moved to a small rented house in Charlottesville. It was a humble end for the woman who had walked the halls of the Hôtel de Langeac in Paris and negotiated with a founding father. Sally Hemings took only a few personal items with her. She left behind the room where she had birthed 6 children. She left behind the grave of the man who had owned her since she was a toddler. She never spoke publicly of her life. She lived quietly with her sons, vanishing into the census rolls, a ghost in the history books, until the DNA tests of the modern era brought her back to life. Back on the mountain, the auction continued for 5 days. By the end of it, the community of Monticello was erased. The cabins were empty. The workshops were silent. The workforce that had sustained the architectural monster was gone, converted into cash to pay the Bank of Virginia and the estate of Tadeusz Kościuszko. Even this liquidation was not enough. The debts were too massive. The proceeds from the sale of the slaves and the furniture barely made a dent in the principal. Martha Jefferson Randolph, the daughter who had tried so hard to maintain the dignity of the name, lost everything. A few years later, in 1831, Monticello itself was sold. The great house, the Temple of American Liberty, went to an eccentric Charlottesville apothecary named James Turner Barclay for a pittance. Barclay hated Jefferson's politics. He cut down the beautiful trees Jefferson had planted to grow silkworms. He let the house rot. The roof leaked. The windows broke. The porticos collapsed. The little mountain became a ruin, a haunted shell occupied by rats and memories. The story of Thomas Jefferson ends not with a marble monument, but with an empty house and a dispersed people. It is a story of a man who could imagine a perfect republic, but could not manage his own checkbook. He was a visionary who saw a future of liberty for all men, yet mortgaged the actual lives of the men and women in his care to buy French mirrors and Italian wine. The debt he left behind was not just monetary. It was a moral deficit that the nation is still paying off. He wrote the words, "All men are created equal," while owning 600 people. He fathered a family he could not love and sold the families of the people who loved him. In the end, the sage of Monticello was a man trapped in a prison of his own making. He built a beautiful labyrinth to hide from the world, to hide from his creditors, and to hide from his own conscience. But on that cold January morning in 1827, the walls came down. The sun shone on the auction block, and the world finally saw the true cost of the American dream. Thomas Jefferson died believing he was leaving a legacy of freedom. In reality, his final act was a transaction of human flesh. The last sound heard at Monticello was not the scratch of a quill on parchment, but the bang of a gavel, selling the very people who had built the pedestal upon which he stood.